Most people think they know what loneliness looks like. They picture an empty room, a cold bed, maybe a window with rain on it. But the kind of loneliness I'm talking about, the kind that lives in this story, doesn't look like any of that. It looks like a woman standing on her own porch at sunrise, coffee in both hands, watching the tree line for something she can't name. It looks like a man who's ridden 1,000 miles and still can't outrun the 1 mile that broke him. This is not a love story, not exactly. It's a story about what happens when two people who have learned to survive alone are forced, by weather, by wound, by plain bad luck, to survive together. For 6 months. In a cabin that was only built for one. What happened between them didn't have a name when it started. By the time it did, neither of them was sure the name fit anymore. I'm the one who watched it happen. I'm the one who kept the log. And I'm telling you now, before you read a single word of what follows, that you will not see the ending coming. Nobody did. Not even them. The first thing you need to understand about Nora Runningwaiter is that she did not make decisions lightly. That's important, because when people hear the story later, and they always hear it wrong, they assume she was lonely enough to do something reckless. They assume she opened her door because she needed something. That's not what happened. What happened is that she found him face down in the snow at the edge of her property line on a Tuesday morning in late October, with a bay mare standing over him like she was waiting for someone to come collect the mess she'd made. The horse wasn't agitated, just patient. The way horses get when they've accepted something their rider hasn't. Nora didn't invite him in right away. She stood at the edge of her porch for a solid 3 minutes, coffee going cold in her hand, watching the shape of him in the white. He wasn't moving, but he was breathing. She could see the small vapor clouds rising from his face each time he exhaled. Alive, then. Inconveniently alive, given that the nearest town was 40 miles east and the pass had been snowed in since the previous night. She had a choice. She made it the way she made all her choices, without drama, without commentary, and with the particular kind of weariness that comes from knowing you are always going to do the right thing no matter how much it complicates your life. She set her coffee down on the porch railing, went back inside for her coat, and went to get him. I should tell you who I am before I go further, because I have a tendency to disappear into the story when I get going, and then people get confused about whose voice they're hearing. My name is Elias Crowfeather. I am Nora's cousin, though cousin covers a lot of ground in our family, and the specific degree of the relation has always been argued at every gathering with more heat than the fire. I am also, in the interest of full disclosure, a man who keeps a notebook. 2, actually, one for facts, one for the things facts don't capture. The story you're reading now lives in the second one. I wasn't at the cabin when Nora dragged the cowboy in from the snow. I got there 3 weeks later, when the pass reopened enough for a careful driver with chains and no particular attachment to their vehicle's undercarriage. What I'm reconstructing here comes partly from what Nora told me, partly from what the cowboy himself said during the weeks I stayed, and partly from observation. Because by the time I arrived, the two of them had already developed a kind of silent grammar between them that told you almost everything you needed to know if you were paying attention. I was paying attention. It's the one thing I've always been good at. His name was Cole Mackay, 38 years old, from a cattle operation outside Cody, Wyoming, though he hadn't been there in almost 2 years by the time Nora found him. 6'1", lean the way people get lean when they've been moving too much and eating too little, with the kind of hands that tell you more than a resume ever could, calloused deep at the base of the fingers, scarred across the knuckles of the right hand, the left thumb sitting at a slight angle that meant it had been broken and not properly set at some point, and had healed according to its own stubborn geometry. He had a name for the mare, Delia. He said it the first night when he was semi-conscious, and Nora was working a cold cloth over his forehead, trying to bring his temperature down. He grabbed her wrist not with aggression, but with sudden focus, like a man surfacing from a dream and grabbing for something solid. Delia, he said just that, his eyes not fully open. Nora told me she understood immediately. She went and stabled the horse before she came back to him. That detail matters. The fact that his first coherent thought was about the horse, not about himself. She filed it somewhere. He had a fever for 4 days. Nora had dealt with worse. She'd come back to her grandmother's cabin on the Crow Reservation land 7 years ago after a decade in Billings. She'd been a surgical nurse. Technically still was if you asked the licensing board, though she hadn't worked a hospital floor since her grandmother's death. She'd come back to the land because her grandmother had left it to her, and because she'd been quietly drowning in the city in a way she hadn't had words for, and because sometimes going back is the only direction that makes sense. She had a medical kit that would have made most rural clinics jealous. She had practical knowledge. She had patience that most people would have called coldness if they didn't know her well enough to see the difference. She treated Cole Mackay the way she treated everything that came to her in difficulty, with competence, and with a careful emotional distance that was not cruelty, just self-preservation. He ran a fever of 103.1 on the second night. She sat with him through it. She didn't tell me why, I didn't ask. There are things you just do when someone else's body is that close to going wrong. He woke on the morning of the 5th day. Nora was at the kitchen table with her coffee, real coffee this time, not the cold, abandoned version from the morning she found him. She was reading, a field guide to high-altitude grasses. This was a thing about Nora that I will return to. She read the most practical, almost aggressively unromantic material, and she read it with the focused absorption other people reserve for novels. As if understanding how bluegrass survived at 9,000 feet was genuinely, urgently interesting. Cole sat up, looked around. He was in the small bedroom off the main room, the one that had been her grandmother's. The ceiling was low, the walls hung with 2 deer mounts, and a hand-stitched wall hanging her grandmother had made from a pattern that had been in the family long enough that no one remembered where it originated. Geometric shapes in red and brown, and the particular shade of cream that Goodwill gets after 50 years. He took in the room. Then he took in himself, the clean clothes that weren't his, the fact that he'd been bathed, the way the blankets were layered with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who knew exactly how much insulation a sick person needed. He came to the doorway of the main room. Nora looked up from her field guide. They regarded each other. He said, "Thank you." She said, "Sit down before you fall down. I'll make eggs." That was how it started. The cabin was 3 rooms. The main room held the kitchen, the wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, bookshelves along 2 walls, and a window that faced west toward the mountain. The small bedroom. And a second structure attached by a covered walkway, a working room that held her tools, her medical supplies in organized bins, a radio, and a narrow cot she sometimes slept on in summer because it was cooler, and she liked the sound of the wind against the corrugated roof. There was no room for Cole Mackay, but there was the cot in the working room once she'd winterized it with an additional stove and better insulation. She did this the week he was recovering, working in increments while he slept without mentioning it. When he was well enough to notice, she simply said, "The pass won't open until April at the earliest. You can stay in there." Not would he like to stay, not could he stay, just you can. He understood the distinction, I think. He said, "I'll work for my keep." She didn't argue. She also didn't agree out loud. She just turned back to whatever she was doing, and Cole learned quickly that Nora's silence wasn't dismissal. It was a form of processing that eventually produced either action or a brief, decisive statement, and that asking her to perform social affirmations she hadn't arrived at yet was a waste of everyone's oxygen. He started bringing in the wood without being asked. She noticed, she didn't say so. He noticed that she noticed. That was the first thing I mean when I talk about the grammar they developed. I should tell you what Cole was running from, because you've probably already guessed that he was running from something. A man doesn't end up face-down in a snowfield 40 miles from anywhere on a horse he treats like family, without some weight pushing him across terrain that much. He wasn't hiding from the law. I want to be clear about that because the easy story would make him dangerous, and Cole wasn't dangerous. He was damaged, which is different. His wife had died 14 months before Nora found him in the snow. Her name was Patricia. She'd been a schoolteacher in Cody. Cancer, the fast, indifferent kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. Just arrives and begins consuming and leaves everyone standing in a hospital corridor, holding paper cups of bad coffee, wondering how the world got the seasons this wrong. He'd sold the cattle operation 8 months after. He couldn't say exactly why, except that he'd found himself standing in the south pasture one morning watching the herd move and feeling absolutely nothing, not grief, not peace, just the specific emptiness of a man whose context has been removed. The ranch had been their life together. Without her, it was just land. He'd packed what he could carry, loaded Delia. Started moving. He told me all of this over the course of my visit, in fragments, the way grieving people often talk, not in narrative, but in pieces that don't connect until you lay them out afterward and look at the shape of them together. He told it without self-pity, which is either a Wyoming thing or a Cole Mackay thing, and I've met enough Wyoming men to guess it was probably both. Nora already knew most of it by the time I arrived. She hadn't asked. He told her because the combination of forced proximity and her particular quality of attention, not interrogative, not sympathetic in the performative way, just genuinely present, made things come out of him that he hadn't planned to say. She'd had her own losses. She didn't offer them up as currency. She just listened. The first 2 weeks settled into a rhythm the way rhythms do when two practical people are forced to share finite resources, not through negotiation so much as through the slow accumulation of small adjustments, each one a concession that neither party acknowledged as such. Cole woke earlier than Nora. He'd have the wood stove going and the water heated before she came out. She made the coffee and didn't offer him any initially, then noticed he looked at the pot the way people look at things they want but have decided they shouldn't ask for, and after that she made enough for two. She cooked, he cleaned. This was not arranged, it simply became true. He fixed things. The cabin had the particular needs of a structure that was well-loved, but slightly beyond the capacity of one person to maintain. A shutter with a loose hinge, a gap in the caulking around the working room's east window, a section of fence along the near pasture where Delia was turned out that had been listing since the previous summer. Cole moved through these repairs the way he moved through everything, quietly, without comment, efficiently. Nora watched him work on the fence one afternoon from the window. She told me she had a strange feeling she couldn't immediately name, something between gratitude and discomfort, the feeling of being in a space that used to be hers alone and noticing it becoming something else. She didn't tell him to stop. She made dinner that night that was slightly better than what she usually bothered with for herself. She didn't mention the fence. He didn't mention the dinner. The grammar again. The snow kept coming through November. There was a quality to those weeks. I've tried to describe it to myself in the notebook I keep for things facts don't capture, and the best I've been able to manage is this. It was like watching two people who had each learned to speak only their own language slowly, without intending to, develop a shared third language that belonged to neither of them. Nora Reed. Cole worked on small projects. He'd asked, around the end of the second week, if there was wood in the working room suitable for carving, and she directed him to a cache of dried pine and willow without asking what for. He started making things. Practical things, mostly. A new handle for a hand axe that had cracked, a set of pegs for the entryway where wet coats were always ending up on the floor, a small box with a fitted lid. He gave her the box without comment, just left it on the kitchen table one morning. She opened it. Inside, it was lined with a piece of leather he'd cut from an old saddlebag, soft from years of use. She put her grandmother's reading glasses in it. He saw this later, didn't say anything. I think that box is the thing I keep coming back to when I try to understand what the first 6 weeks were. The box wasn't a declaration. It was just a made thing, offered without expectation. And the way she used it, immediately, practically, for something that mattered to her, was also just a thing, done without ceremony. But both of them were paying attention. The second time Nora let something show was harder to watch and harder to write. It was the 3rd week of November. I know this because I'd been writing dates in my notebook, the factual ones, since I got there. She'd been up late, something she did periodically, quiet insomnia that she managed by sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp on and reading until the thing in her brain that wouldn't settle finally gave up. Cole had learned not to acknowledge these nights unless she indicated she wanted company. He slept in the working room with the kind of immediate unconsciousness that characterized people who are physically tired enough not to have room for nighttime thought, which Nora had noted and seemed, in some complicated way, both to envy and to find faintly irritating. On this particular night, she was sitting at the table when she heard a sound that made her go still. He was dreaming, the kind of dream that makes noise. Just one word, repeated twice, low and broken at the edges in the particular way that unconscious grief has, raw in a way people almost never let themselves be while awake. The name was Patricia. Nora sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. Then she got up, went quietly to the door of the working room, and looked in through the gap, not intruding, just checking the way she checked, the way nurses check, from habit and from a kind of care that bypasses the usual requirements of intimacy. He wasn't in distress in the way that required intervention. He was just dreaming. She went back to the table. She didn't read any more that night. She just sat with her hands around her cold coffee cup and looked at the window and the dark mountains beyond it. I asked her once, much later, what she'd been thinking. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I was thinking that grief is the same regardless of where you come from. That seemed important at the time." It was, it still is. The month of December arrived the way December always arrives in that country, not gradually, but all at once, as if the mountain had made a decision. The temperature dropped to -22 the week before Christmas. The horses Nora had two of her own, a roan mare named Fort and a gray gelding she called Tuesday, were brought into the barn close to the cabin. Delia was with them. The three of them in the straw, Fort and Tuesday already comfortable, Delia acclimating, eyeing them with the sideways assessment of an animal in new social territory. Cole spent a lot of time in the barn during those first bitter cold weeks. I think it was where he was most himself, not because he was a barn kind of man specifically, but because the barn had a quality of simple requirement that worked for him. The horses needed things, warmth, feed, water, company. Cole provided them. The transaction was clear. Nora came to the barn on Christmas Eve. She didn't celebrate Christmas. Neither did Cole in any particular organized way. But there is something about that date that exists regardless of doctrine, a kind of cultural pressure in the dark of the year that finds you even when you're not looking for it. She came in with 2 cups of coffee, this time laced with something from a bottle she kept in the bookshelf between a soil chemistry textbook and a collection of Plains history. She handed him one. He took it. They sat on a hay bale on opposite ends, the horses moving slowly in the background, Delia coming to put her nose against Cole's shoulder after a while and staying there. They were there for nearly 2 hours. He talked about his wife, more than he had before, not the facts of her illness, which he'd told Nora early, but the texture of her. How she laughed, how she'd held a coffee cup with both hands even in summer, how she'd hated the way he folded towels and had eventually just refrained from mentioning it rather than fight that particular losing battle again. Nora listened. When he ran out of talking, she said, after a pause, "My grandmother used to say that the people we carry with us are just the parts of ourselves we haven't recognized yet." Cole was quiet. Then he said, "I'm not sure I follow that." "Neither am I entirely," she said. She was smarter than both of us. He made a sound that was close enough to a laugh that Delia shifted her feet in mild surprise. "That was Christmas. I wasn't there, but when Nora told me about it, she had a look on her face that I recognized from a long time ago. A look she'd had as a girl sometimes, when something had moved her, and she was deciding whether to admit it. She had decided this time not to, but it was there. January came in fast and mean, and with it came the first real conflict. Cole had been doing a slow inventory of the working room in the way that organized people do when they've been inhabiting a space long enough to see its systems. And he found, on the 3rd shelf from the bottom behind a box of waterproofing compound, a medical supply bag that had clearly not been opened in some time. He didn't touch it, but he mentioned it to Nora that evening. She went very still. It was the kind of stillness that meant something. He recognized it by then, the difference between her ordinary stillness, which was just her resting state, and the charged kind that had a history behind it. "That's not for inventory," she said. "I know I wasn't. It's my grandmother's, her last things," she stopped. Then carefully, "I'm not ready to go through it." He said, "Okay." Just that. He didn't offer to help. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't circle back to it later with some well-meaning follow-up. He just filed it in the same place she filed his things, the place where you put things that belong to another person's grief, and left it alone. But that night, Nora took the bag out of the working room and put it in her own bedroom. Not because he'd made her feel it was in the way. but because the presence of someone who understood the category of not yet made her feel, for the first time since her grandmother died, that the category was allowed, that she didn't have to be ready on any schedule. She cried that night, quietly in her own room, the way she did everything without performance, without asking to be witnessed. She told me about this part herself. She was matter-of-fact about it in the telling. That, too, was Nora. The end of part 1 comes here, though the story didn't have parts at the time. It was just life accumulating. What I want to leave you with, as January sat heavy on that mountain, is this. By the time 6 weeks had passed, 2 things were true simultaneously, and neither of them knew quite what to do with the combination. The first was that Cole Mackay was healing, not dramatically, not in any way he would have pointed to if you'd asked him directly, because he was not a man who tracked his own recovery with that kind of attention. But he was sleeping better. He was eating better. He was building things. He was talking about Patricia in the past tense, not only in the present tense of grief, which is its own kind of milestone. The moment when someone you've lost becomes someone you carry rather than someone who is simply, constantly, freshly gone. The second was that Nora running waiter, who had not been lonely in any way she'd allowed herself to name, had started to notice the specific and unfamiliar weight of knowing that this situation was temporary. The pass would open in April. That was 3 months away. She had begun counting. The thing about a cabin in deep winter is that it doesn't allow you to perform yourself. In the city, I know this from my own years in Missoula before I came back to work the family land, you can construct an entire identity out of the distance you put between yourself and everyone else. Your commute, your headphones, your carefully curated social perimeter. You can be lonely on your own terms, which is almost comfortable, which is almost the point. In the cabin, in the dark of January and February, with the temperature outside making your eyelashes freeze the moment you stepped past the door, and the firewood going down at a rate that required constant attention, and the nearest other human being 40 miles east on a road that was still impassable. In that place, you had only what you'd actually brought with you. Cole Mackay had brought his work ethic, his horse, his grief, his ability to stay quiet in a room without filling it with noise, and a slow, deep attentiveness to the physical world that was partly Wyoming and partly something that had always just been him. Nora had brought her grandmother's land, her field guides and history books, a nursing competence that extended well past the clinical into something more like instinct, a reserve that was not coldness but had been mistaken for it often enough that she'd stopped correcting people. And this was the thing I noticed, watching her in the weeks I was there, and confirmed in her grandmother's journals that Nora eventually let me read. A quality of loyalty that was so deep and so quietly given that most people never recognized it as the extraordinary thing it was until it was no longer there. These 2 people in a 3-room cabin through the dead center of a Rocky Mountain winter. What happened next was not what either of them expected. But it also, in retrospect, couldn't have been anything else. January gave them a routine that was almost military in its structure, which was not coincidental. Routine is what people build when the alternative is thinking too hard about everything else. Mornings, coal and the wood stove and the water, coffee for 2, Nora with her books at the table, not talking until she was ready to talk, which he'd learned to wait for the way you learn to wait for a gauge to settle before you take a reading. Breakfast sometime mid-morning. Then the outdoor work, the barn, the fence checks, the firewood, the daily assessment of what the mountain was doing. These tasks divided naturally, not assigned. Just divided, the way 2 people in a small space inevitably divide the available labor if they're both functional and neither is keeping score. Afternoons were less structured. This was where it got complicated. Cole had his carving. He'd moved on from practical items to something harder to categorize, small figures mostly. Animals at first, a bear in the posture of a bear at rest, something about the way it caught the weight of the thing. A wolf mid-stride, too detailed for something made with a utility knife and patience. Then, in the 2nd week of January, Nora came in from the barn to find him working on something she couldn't immediately identify. She didn't ask. She watched from across the room, coat still on, while he worked, bent over, the small knife moving with a precision that she recognized. The way you recognize skill in any medium as something that comes from a very long acquaintance with the material. What emerged over the course of about 40 minutes while she sorted her barn supplies on the other side of the room was a horse. Delia, not a generic horse, but specifically Delia, the particular angle of her head, the slight dish in her nose, the way she held her left ear slightly back when she was relaxed. He finished it and held it up to the light and turned it once and set it on the table without ceremony. Nora said, still sorting without looking up, "That's very good." "She's a good subject," he said. "Stays still." There was a pause. "She doesn't stay still," Nora said. "She stays still for me." Another pause. "That's not something every horse does," Nora said. "No," he said, "I know." That was all, but there was a quality to the silence after it that had changed from the silences before it. Something had been acknowledged that neither of them had named. The fight happened on the 14th of January. I know the date because Cole told me later, with the specificity of a person who has turned a memory over enough times to polish it down to its exact shape. January 14th, he was fairly sure. It started with something small, the way real fights always start. Nora had a system for her supply organization in the working room that was apparent once you knew what it was, but that was not obvious on first examination. Organized by task and usage frequency rather than by category, which was the sensible thing for a single person who always knew where she was going and why, but which made less immediate sense to someone helping themselves to supplies without that map. Cole had reorganized a section of the shelves. Not all of them. One section, the medical supplies, which he'd been going into for the first time since arriving to treat a cut on his hand that had needed proper wrapping, and which he'd found confusing enough to straighten while he was in there. Nora discovered it that afternoon. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood in the working room for a moment. Then she came into the main room and said, very evenly, "Did you move things in the supply section?" Cole looked up. He registered the evenness immediately. He'd lived with a woman for 11 years, and he knew that particular kind of even. "I straightened the medical shelf, couldn't find what I needed." "I know where everything is." "I couldn't find it." "Because you don't know the system." "Then maybe the system," he stopped, started again. "If there's a system, it might help to know it." "I didn't realize you were going to be in there regularly." "I'm trying to help." "I know you are," she paused. "I didn't ask you to help with the supplies." "Nora, this is my grandmother's working room." Her voice stayed even, but something came through the evenness, something pressurized. "She organized it. I haven't changed it. I know where every single thing is because I learned it from her, and that matters to me in a way I'm not going to explain further." Silence. Cole put down what he'd been working on. He said, "I didn't know that. I'm sorry." Nora turned and went back into the working room. He heard, over the next 10 minutes, the careful sound of her restoring the organization to what it had been. He'd made a mistake that was also, on some level, a kind of trespass, not intentional but real. He'd moved into her space in the particular way that well-meaning people move into spaces, assuming that help is always welcome, that improvement is always wanted. He sat with that. When she came back out, she set the lantern on the table and sat down across from him and looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I should have explained the room when you got here." He said, "You shouldn't have had to." She looked at him. That was a thing she did when something surprised her. She looked at you directly and slightly longer than was socially comfortable, and you either flinched or you didn't. He didn't. She said, "The bag I mentioned, her last things." She also organized the medical supplies. She was a midwife for 30 years, and before that she learned from her own grandmother. The way things are arranged in there it's a kind of record. He was quiet. "I understand," he said. "Then I'll put back everything exactly as I found it." "I already did." "Okay." She picked up her book, then put it back down. "The cut," she said. "On your hand, let me see it." He held it out. She looked at it with the clinical attention she brought to everything physical, assessing. Not gentle, not rough, just accurate. She rewrapped it in about 90 seconds with the economy of someone who has done this 10,000 times. She didn't let go of his hand immediately. She wasn't aware she was still holding it, I think, or she was aware and didn't correct it. He didn't move. Then she let go and picked up her book, and that was the end of it. What I've been dancing around, and what I have to say plainly at some point if this account is going to be honest, is that by February something had shifted that was more than two practical people working out a coexistence arrangement. I was there for it, not the slow months of it. I arrived in mid-November, well after the beginning, and I left again before the end, because I had my own land and my own animals, and I couldn't stay indefinitely. But I was there for a crucial middle section, and what I was watching in that cabin was two damaged people in the process of discovering that damage is not the same as incompatibility. I don't mean to make it sound like a romance when I say it. The word romance carries a lot of freight that doesn't fit. What I mean is something quieter and, in its way, more significant. Two people who had each, through loss and choice and the particular circumstances of their lives, come to believe they were finished with a certain kind of knowing another person, and who were now, in the involuntary intimacy of that mountain winter, finding out they were wrong. Nora had not been with anyone since a relationship that ended 5 years before her grandmother died. Not in the way of someone who'd closed down in bitterness, but in the way of someone who'd reorganized their priorities and found that alone was manageable, and that manageable was, for a while, sufficient. Cole had been with his wife for 11 years. Before her there had been the ranch, and before the ranch there had been rodeo circuits, and before the rodeo circuits there had been enough of the ordinary young man things to constitute a history. Since Patricia's death there had been no one. This wasn't a vow. It was simply the state of a man who had not been ready, who had not been present in himself in any way that would have made connection possible. February on that mountain, something in both of them shifted. It didn't happen in a single scene. That's the part that doesn't make it into the stories people tell about these things. The stories make it a moment, a look, a specific charged exchange. The reality was accumulative. 17 weeks of firewood and coffee and shared meals and the particular quality of watching someone work, of being watched working, of making something for someone and having it used, of having your grief witnessed without commentary, of witnessing another person's grief the same way. By February, they knew each other in the specific way that enforced proximity produces, the small catalog of a person's actual self, the self they can't curate when there's no audience to perform for. The night it became undeniable was not dramatic. There was a windstorm, the kind that comes down off the mountain with a sound like something enormous moving through the trees, and the cabin interior goes fully dark because the lamp flickers out, and there's a moment, just a moment, where the structure around you feels provisional, the way all structures feel provisional when the mountain reminds you of the difference in scale. Nora's lamp went out. She was on her side of the main room. Cole was on his, the carving he'd been working on in his hands. In the dark and the wind sound, she said his name. Just that. Not asking for anything specific. Not a question, just his name, which was also, I know you're there, which was also, this is strange and I am in it with you. He said, here. The storm continued for another 3 hours. They sat in the dark, each in their own chair on their own side of the room, and they talked, about everything and about nothing. The way people sometimes talk in the dark, because the absence of visual information removes a certain kind of self-consciousness. He talked about the rodeo. She talked about Billings, about what she'd been before her grandmother's death had clarified something in her about where she needed to be. He told her about the day he'd met Patricia, which was not the romantic story it sounds like. He'd actually been concussed at the time from a fall off a fence post, and had initially thought she was his sister, and Patricia had found this so funny that she'd nearly dropped the ice pack she was holding to his head. Nora laughed at that. It was the first time Cole had heard her laugh, really laugh, the full version, not the contained exhale she gave to things she found wryly amusing. It was a different sound than he'd expected, lower and more surprised, as if she hadn't quite anticipated letting it out. He said later that he knew in that moment. Knew what I asked him. He said that I was in trouble. He didn't say it like a bad thing. The first week of February brought something neither of them had quite prepared for, a second person on the mountain. An older man, Lakota, though he'd been living off the reservation land for years in the way that some people live everywhere and nowhere, arrived with a mule and a problem. His name was Bernard, which he immediately told Cole was not his real name, just the one he used with people who were going to have trouble with his real name, which proved to be true even with Nora, who made 3 attempts before he waved her off with good humor and said, "Bernard is fine." His mule had thrown a shoe and had the beginnings of a sole bruise. He'd known Nora's grandmother. He stayed 3 days. Bernard had the quality, common in people who have lived alone for a long time, of saying things without warning that were either profound or baffling, and the gap between the two was not always immediately clear. On the second evening, sitting at the table over dinner, he looked between Nora and Cole with the particular assessment of an old man who has seen enough of the world to read the space between people rather than the people themselves. He said to Cole, "How long you staying?" Cole said, "Till the pass opens." Bernard picked up his coffee cup. "You could probably get through now, you know. Weather's been easy enough last week." Nora said from the stove, "The north section is still impassable." Bernard made a sound that could have been agreement. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. Cole didn't look at Nora when Bernard said it. She didn't look at Cole. But after Bernard left on the 3rd day, Cole went out to the barn and did not come back in for a long time. And Nora, in the main room alone, stood at the window looking at the West Mountain with her coffee, 2 hands, the same way she'd been standing the morning she'd found him in the snow, and she did not look the way she'd looked that morning. That morning she'd been calculating. Now she was feeling. The difference was visible if you knew what to look for, which by February I did. The hardest part of February, for the story, not for me. I was back on my own land by then, and Nora told me about this much later, was the question that kept not getting asked. What is this? Not asked by Cole, who had lived long enough with grief to know that naming things too early was a way of frightening them away. Not asked by Nora, who had lived long enough with herself to know that she didn't yet have an answer she trusted. The question sat between them like a third occupant of the cabin, taking up space. Not uncomfortable exactly, but present in a way that changed the quality of everything around it. There was a moment, Nora told me, when she almost said it. They'd been working on a project together. She'd wanted to reinforce the section of the barn roof that was showing stress from the snow accumulation, and Cole had designed a brace that was structurally sound and had walked her through the installation. It was physical work that required coordination, the two of them on opposite ends of a beam, speaking in short, practical sentences. Hold here, up on my count there, good. The work language of people who trust each other's competence. When they were done, they stood back and looked at what they'd made. She said later that she'd looked at the line of the brace against the barn interior and felt something that took her a moment to identify. What she'd felt was pride, not in the work, though the work was good, pride in the we of it, the fact of having made something together and having it stand. She almost said it then. Instead she said, "Good work," and he said, "You too," and they went back to the cabin and made dinner. The question didn't go away, but it was patient. By the last week of February, the pass was beginning to show signs of thaw. Just signs, nothing you could act on yet, but the signs were real. Cole noticed them. He didn't mention them to Nora. She noticed them too. She didn't mention them to Cole. They both knew that the other had noticed. The grammar of not saying things had gotten very sophisticated by late February. There was a night near the end of the month when Cole finished a piece he'd been working on for 3 weeks. He'd been careful about it, working in the evenings when Nora was reading, turning the piece away from her when she passed, which she'd noticed and hadn't remarked on. It was a carving of 2 horses, not Delia, not Fort or Tuesday, 2 horses that weren't specifically any horse, the kind of idealized particular that artists sometimes achieve when they're working from feeling rather than observation. They were side by side, not touching, facing the same direction. There was something in the angle of their necks, the slight orientation of their heads toward each other, that was not quite distance and not quite contact. He set it on the table without ceremony, the way he'd set the box. Nora looked at it for a long time. She didn't say anything. She picked it up and took it to the windowsill and set it there, facing west toward the mountain. Where it stayed. March was coming. April was coming. And neither of them had said the thing that was sitting in the middle of the cabin, patient as a horse in a stable, waiting for someone to open the door. March came in the way it always does in that country, with false hope. There were 3 days of warmth in the first week that made the south-facing slopes run with melt and turned the road down to the pass into something that looked, from a distance, like it might be navigable. Cole went and looked at it on the third day, took the walk down the grade with his hands in his jacket pockets and the light hitting the snowmelt in the particular way that high-altitude early spring light has, making everything temporary and bright. He came back and said, "Not yet, North Face still packed deep, maybe another month." Nora at the table didn't look up. She said, "That's what I thought." He'd brought back a piece of quartz from the walk, amber-veined, the kind you see sometimes when the snowmelt exposes the ground. He set it on the windowsill beside the 2 horses without thinking about it. She looked at the windowsill later, and something moved across her face that she filed away where she filed everything. But I think she kept it out of the file and turned it over for a while before she put it back. The fall spring collapsed in the second week with a 3-day storm that reset everything. They were fully snowed in again. The wood supply was adequate. Cole had been meticulous through February about keeping it ahead of need. But there was a quality to the second closure that was different from the first. In October and November, the snowing in had been an external fact that they'd had to adapt to. Now, in March, it felt chosen in some way that neither of them could fully articulate, which made it both easier and more complicated. On the second day of the storm, Nora got out her grandmother's bag. Cole was in the working room. She sat at the kitchen table with the bag in front of her, the way you sit with something you've been building up to for a long time and have finally decided to stop building up to. Inside, her grandmother's stethoscope, an old one, not the modern kind, with an ivory earpiece that had been repaired 3 times and had the patina of 70 years of use. A small notebook with handwritten notes on births, dates, names, the complications, and their resolutions, written in a precise, closely spaced hand that Nora recognized because it looked like her own handwriting's ancestor. A folded cloth she didn't unfold immediately. A beaded bracelet, traditional work, old enough to have been her great-grandmother's. She went through these things one at a time. She was crying before she reached the bracelet, not loudly, just present, the way grief finally presents itself when you've decided to let it. Cole came through at some point for more wood. He saw her. He set down the wood. He came and sat in the other chair, and he didn't say anything. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer words. He just was there. The way she'd been there for him on Christmas Eve in the barn. The way she'd been there through 4 days of fever, not as a nurse, just as a human presence in the same space. She finished crying eventually. She folded the cloth. It was an old weaving, a pattern she didn't know, but that felt familiar in the way that things inherited through blood feel familiar even when they're new to you. She said she would have liked you, I think. Cole said what was her name. Alma, her own name for herself, was Strikes Away Clouds, which her mother gave her because she was born during a storm. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My grandmother's name was June." She would have been appalled by me sitting here not knowing how to help. Nora made the sound that was close to a laugh, the surprised one. "You're helping," she said. She put the things back in the bag, slowly, with the care of someone returning something to a place of honor. She set the bracelet last, on the outside, on top of everything else. Then she closed the bag. She looked at it for a moment. She put it back in the working room, but not on the 3rd shelf from the bottom. She put it on the highest shelf, where she could see it from the door. April's first week. The pass opened on the 8th. Cole got the news on the radio, the county road report, which he checked every morning now without saying why he was checking it, though they both knew. He listened. He came in from the working room. Nora was at the table. He said, "Pass opened this morning. They're running plows through to the junction." She said, "I heard." A pause. "Road'll be clear by tomorrow, probably," he said. "Probably." He sat down across from her. This is the moment that people want to make into something cinematic. The charged conversation, the declaration, the scene. I'm going to tell you what Nora told me it actually was and trust you with the reality of it. Cole sat down. He looked at the windowsill, the carving, the quartz, the 3 things in a row that had accumulated there without ceremony. He said, "I don't know where I'm going." Nora said, "You mentioned Wyoming." "I mentioned Wyoming 8 weeks ago. I'm not sure Wyoming is what I meant." She looked at him. He said, "I'm not." He stopped, started again. He was not a man given to speeches, and this showed. "I'm not going to ask you something today, because I think today is not the right day for it, and I think you'd probably say no out of caution, which would be fair." She was quiet for a moment. Then, what day would be the right day? "I don't know," he met her eyes, "but not today." She picked up her coffee cup. She said, "You should stay until you know where you're going." He said, "That might be a while. The cot in the working room isn't comfortable. You should have the bedroom." He said, "Nora." "Cole," she set down the cup, "I'm saying you can stay." He was quiet. "I know," he said finally. "The horses have gotten used to each other," she said. "It would be disruptive." He made the sound that was almost a laugh. Delia shifted in the barn, 80 feet away, with the uncanny timing of a horse who's been in the conversation the whole time. He said, "All right." She picked up her field guide, a new one, High Desert Grasses, which she'd moved on to in February without explanation. She opened it to her bookmark. He went to get his carving from the working room. They sat at the table, across from each other, and the afternoon came in through the west window the way afternoons do in April, tentative, warm in the light and cold at the edges, nothing decided yet. He didn't leave in April. He was still there in May when I came back through on my way north. I stayed 2 days. The grammar between them by then was, I want to say settled, but settled isn't quite right, because there was still an unresolved quality to it, an ongoing negotiation that hadn't concluded. But it was a good kind of unresolved. The kind that means there's more to come, not the kind that means something was abandoned. Cole had expanded his work in the barn, there were projects going, lumber organized, a new stall he was framing. Nora had not asked him to do this. He'd proposed it. She'd looked at the design and suggested 2 modifications. He'd made them. The stall was better for it. She'd started bringing him her field guides in the evenings and asking his opinion on the landscape observations. Not because she needed a second opinion, but because she'd found that articulating her thinking out loud to someone who listened carefully sharpened her own understanding of what she was seeing. Cole was not a botanist or a soil scientist, but he was a man who'd worked land his whole life, and he had a particular instinct for what the ground was telling you if you paid attention to it. They'd been fighting again, mildly, about the wood stove. Cole had strong opinions about optimal burn rate, and Nora had equally strong opinions that differed from his, and they'd reached a temporary détente that neither of them was fully satisfied with, which meant the argument had a future. I watched them at dinner that first night of my visit. They talked the way people talk who have run out of the need to perform their interest in each other, which sounds like it should be boring, but is actually the opposite. It's the absence of performance that makes conversation real. They disagreed 3 times over the course of the meal, twice about practical things, and once about whether the county had handled the road plowing adequately, which was a proxy argument about something else that I couldn't quite identify and didn't try. After dinner, Cole went to the barn to check the horses. He did this every night last thing. Nora cleared the table, poured herself the last of the coffee. I said, "You look better than the last time I saw you." She said, "You look exactly the same." "I always look exactly the same. That's my specialty." I paused. "He's not leaving." She said, "He leaves when he has somewhere to go." "You could tell him he already does." She looked at me, the long, slightly uncomfortable look. She said, "Ilias, let it be what it is." I let it be what it was. Cole came back from the barn. He poured himself a cup of coffee. There wasn't enough left, but there was enough. He sat down. Nora moved the field guide to make room for his cup. It was a small thing. The way moving over to make room is always a small thing. I wrote it down in my second notebook anyway. The last thing I want to tell you, and then I'll stop, because this is a story that needs to end before its end rather than after. The last thing is something that happened on the morning I was leaving. I was loading my truck. It was early, the mountains still holding the blue that the sky gets at 5:30 before the sun clears the east ridge. Cole was already up because Cole was always already up. He helped me with the last of the gear without me asking. When we were done, he leaned against the truck and looked at the cabin for a moment. The west window was lit, Nora at the table with her coffee, visible through the glass. Reading something, probably. She hadn't said goodbye yet. She would come out when I started the engine, which was her version of ceremony. I said, "What are you going to do?" He said, "Work, stay useful." He paused. "She's teaching me the supply system in the working room." He said it the way you say a thing that is about one thing but means another. I said, "She doesn't teach that to people." He looked at me. I said, "Her grandmother taught her over 30 years. Cole turned back to look at the lit window. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "I know." Quietly, the way you say something you've been sitting with and have finally decided you believe. I started the truck. The engine turned over and Nora appeared at the door of the cabin, coat half on, coffee cup in her hand. She came down the steps. We hugged briefly, the way our family has always hugged, not effusive but real. She looked at me, then at Cole, then she went back inside without saying anything to him. He watched her go. Then he went and picked up the axe that was leaning against the wood pile and started splitting the morning's wood. The sound of it followed me down the grade for longer than I expected. The clean, regular knock of the axe, each swing settling into the particular rhythm of a man who knows he's going to be at this for a while and is not in any hurry to be done. I thought about what she'd said the evening before, "Let it be what it is." I thought about what it was. A woman who had come back to a land that held her grandmother's life, still learning what that meant. A man who had lost the life he'd built and was building differently now, more slowly, more deliberately, with a different kind of care. A cabin with 3 rooms and a window facing west. 2 carved horses on the sill. A quartz stone amber-veined from one thaw. A supply room with a system handed down through women who'd spent their lives knowing how to help. Its highest shelf now holding something that had been stored in the dark for too long. I drove east toward the junction. The pass was clear. The morning was cold and clean and entirely uncommitted, the way April mornings are, still deciding what they want to be. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Some things you know are still happening when you can no longer see them. Some things you just drive toward the morning and trust.